Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC 2024 Summer Split Primer video. Very excited to get back into the LEC. We've kind of had a big break in between MSI and a lot of these other regions kicking up. It's really just been the LPL that's been there to hold us over, but the LEC is kicking off tomorrow, and so I'm very excited to get this video out here today. If you are new to the channel, what we're going to do is go through every single team, all 10 of them, in the LEC. I'll be talking about every team's expectations, where I think they're personally going to land. I will be ranking not only all of the teams, but all of the players as well, individually in their positions, as well as giving them grades from A+ down to potentially D. And so I'll be going over everything that has to do with the LEC here today. I'll be talking about playstyles. This is kind of an overview for people who might not be as familiar with some of the roster changes, but also if you just want to know my opinions on who I think might do well and might not do well with the new changes, this is the video for that. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. I don't usually ask this at the beginning of these videos, but these primer videos are the probably most intensive to make over the course of this year that we do. And so if you find yourself enjoying it, maybe not now, but in 10, 20, 30 minutes, go ahead and hit that like button. It really does mean a lot. Again, I don't usually ask for that at the beginning of videos, but these primer videos are definitely some of the more intensive in terms of film watching that we do, because not only am I watching all the new people that are coming into the LEC, but I go and rewatch a lot of games from the previous splits to get better ideas of just making sure I'm not overlooking or underlooking any of the players in the LEC currently. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. We're going to start off here with a little bit of a disclaimer. I do have to put this at the beginning of these primer videos. The big disclaimer is that at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. There are going to be people in the comment section that think I am out of my mind for some of the rankings of not only the teams, but the players, or some of the grades that I give players. There are going to be people that think a certain player is too high or too low, or, you know, whatever, right? At the end of the day, this is just my opinion. Your opinion is going to be different than mine somewhere in this video. There are going to probably be quite a few differences from my opinion to yours in this video. That's okay. I'm happy to have those conversations down in the comments section, as long as they're, you know, constructive, as long as they're conversations. If you just say, well, this guy clearly doesn't watch the games, well, I have an entire channel showing that I watch the games, and so obviously that's kind of a ridiculous thing to say. But up on the screen now, you're going to see my grading scale. I just wanted to get that disclaimer out of the way first. And the other disclaimer is I'm going to be talking about this grading scale, because one thing that I really like to impart at the beginning of these videos is that the scale is very flexible. I see a lot of people get really hung up on these grades, get really hung up on the difference between a B and a B+, and saying that I'm ridiculous for having a player at A- when he should be an A, or I'm ridiculous for having a player at a B when he should be a B+, or whatever, right? These are very close. Like, these grades, especially back-to-back, are very similar, and I'll kind of go over what I think for each of these letter grades and why I think individual players might receive one grade over the other. But I can't impart enough, I can't stress enough at the beginning of this video that if you're one off of my grade, or if you're, you know, two off of my ranking for a player, we probably have very similar opinions. It's not really that deep in terms of the differences between these grades. Again, a very flexible scale, but we'll talk about it now. If I give a player an A+ grade, that means they are the best player in this region by a pretty large margin. And especially in the LEC, that means that I think this player could actually compete against LPL and LCK, like top tier players, and there's only one of those. It's not going to be a surprise who it is, but A+ is really like the top of the top, the clear best player in the region. A represents superstars. These are players that are going to be MVP frontrunners in almost any single circumstance. They are going to be players that are constantly contending for titles. I mean, A is still an elite grade. A+ is very, very rare. A is still one of the best players that can compete with other, you know, top tier region players. A- is elite. These are still, you know, top 5 players in the region. These are players that are going to be competing to win the MVP, but maybe aren't going to be as consistent as the A+ or the A players. You might have a split where they're closer to 3rd or 4th in their role, but you also might have a split in which they just run things over and win MVP. That's super possible. Anybody in the A tier is an elite level player, somebody that would start for any team in the West without any questions. Then once you start getting into the Bs, B+ and B are very similar. I like to say they have the same highs. B+ and B are both really good starters that you're going to feel very good about, and their best games are probably going to look very similar. The difference to me is the consistency. B+ players are players that I expect to be very good a lot of the time, whereas B players might even have better highs than the B+ players, but aren't going to be as consistent from a game-to-game basis. I value consistency very highly because I do think that if you're good on a game-to-game basis, it opens up the rest of your team to actually find a concrete playing style. And so if you're a B+ player, I think that that's, yeah, you're a really good player that can pop off at any given moment, and you're going to do it very consistently. If you're a B, you're a very good player that can pop off at any moment, but you might have a couple of games here or there where you're just not as consistent. And then B- is where it starts to get like, you're an okay starter. I feel fine about you starting. It's certainly not the worst situation in the entire world. You can do very well in the LEC with a B- as your quote-unquote weak link. You could be a top 2, top 3 team in the LEC with that, but they're probably not going to be the kind of player that's pushing you over the top. You can't really have a full team of B- and expect to be a top 3-ish team in the LEC. And then once you start getting into the Cs, this is where it starts to get a little bit questionable. C+, weak starter. This is somebody who probably deserves a shot to show that they can stay in the LEC, but certainly hasn't proven enough to say that they have to be in the LEC, and probably won't be the kind of player that's pushing to get top 3 or top 4 or get into that, best of 5 part of the playoffs. And then you're getting to the Cs. C is where you get to like borderline starter. These are players that have not proven that they deserve to be in the LEC, that have not proven that they deserve to have a starting spot, and will need to prove that. They have upside, or potentially they've shown things in the past that would lead me to believe that they could potentially become an okay starter, but they really have not proven that, and they're players that I think would be considered on the hot seat. I think hot seat definitely starts at C+, but it is like super, super hot at C. And then C- or D or anything below C is going to be not starter quality. I think C- means that I think theoretically you could get to a place where, they could be starter quality, but it's unlikely. And then D is just like, I don't think this player is ever going to be a starting caliber player at an LEC level. But that's the grading scale. Again, if you have a difference in like B+ to B or B+ to A- or one grade like that, I promise that we're not far off. This is a very flexible grading scale, and I think it really is all up to interpretation and to opinion. But with that out of the way, with that disclaimer and that overview out of the way, it's time to get into the primer itself. I'm very excited. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go from number 10 to number 1 in my personal power rankings going into summer, talking about every single team, every single player, giving expectations for what you can reasonably expect from them throughout this split, or at least what the expectations are throughout this split. And then, of course, I will be giving my predictions on who I think will be doing well in summer and, going to playoffs and potentially representing the LEC at Worlds. So without further ado, let's jump into number 10. Number 10 in my power rankings is not going to surprise a lot of people. I think, especially after some of the other upgrades this offseason or this mid-season, this team is clearly probably the weakest on paper, and they've really not shown a lot over the course of this year. Coming in at number 10 for me, it is going to be Rogue. I don't think this is going to be particularly controversial. I think Rogue is a team that everybody's looking at with kind of bated breath, saying, the upside's just not really there. Clearly, the players on this team do not gel, do not click together. The play styles, we've talked about it all year long, are very anti-synergistic, if you will, especially mid-jungle, who have both made each other worse with the way that they play the game, and I don't really think you have anybody else in this team that's going to step up and really make things worthwhile. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Finn in the top lane, Marcoon in the jungle, Larson in the mid lane, Comp at AD carry, and Zoelise at support. There is theoretical good to this team. I think individually all of these players have shown something in the past. I think obviously Larson is a player that has been looked at as a borderline top 2, top 3 mid laner at his best. This is a guy who has gone to the quarterfinals of Worlds, who has been on championship teams here in the LEC. But, as we've talked about throughout this year, his synergy with Marcoon, or the lack of synergy with Marcoon, has really hurt him. He's a player that relies a lot on his ability to play with his jungler, and these two just do not have good chemistry together, and it's really hurt this team overall. Larson is still going to rank as the highest ranked player on this team, coming in at number 7 in terms of the mid lane rankings, a B- in terms of player grades. I think Larson in a better situation if he were to play with a jungler who was more aggressive in the early game like he had gotten used to with someone like Malrang. I think if he were in that situation again, he would be a B to a B+ kind of player. That is a lot more of what I think Larson's current skill level is. That being said, he's not going to play like a B+ or a B player on this team because, again, it's just not very synergistic to his individual play style. Very slow mid laner, somebody who wants to play a little bit weaker in the early game, doesn't necessarily need a lot of lane prio or pressure because he wants to play for team fights. He wants to play Azir, he wants to try to front to back, he wants to be a hyper carry in the 5v5s. It means he's not going to be there for a lot of the mid-game skirmishes, and luckily for Rogue, there aren't a lot of mid-game skirmishes for Larson to miss out on, but unluckily for Rogue, that's the meta right now, and so they just kind of get completely out-tempoed. But Larson, always known as a bit more of a scaler, certainly not a dominant lane threat that's going to solo kill you 1v1 in lane. That's just never really been his playstyle, and I think especially on a team where he has to be the #1 option, it's just kind of exacerbated how it doesn't end up working out like that. Reminds me a lot of Jensen on Dignitas last year when he was given the keys to the kingdom and essentially asked to be this really big playmaker. It's just not the style that I think Larssen ends up working out in. So do I think Larssen would be better in a different circumstance? Yes, I just don't think that's going to happen here on Rogue, and so this is my compromise. But everybody else in this team has major question marks. We already talked a bit about Marcoon, but he's going to fall all the way down to number 10. In terms of my jungle rankings, I still like Marcoon. Again, I think this is a lot more of a fit problem than it is a Marcoon problem, but there is something to be said for being a jungler that functions best in late game team fights and that not being super valuable in the current game. And I think that that's just the unfortunate truth of where Marcoon is at. He's really not an aggressive early game jungler. He's never been aggressive early, like with Excel, with SK. He's never been the kind of player that wants to establish dominance in terms of skirmishing in the mid game. He's not going to try and push the tempo too much. He's going to play relatively safe, relatively clean, and then get into these late game fights and be a really big impact on things like the Wukong and these other team fight initiators. It's always kind of been the way that Marcoon wants to play. But again, when you're pairing that with Larssen in the mid lane, who's also not really going to push the tempo, then you're just giving over so much pressure and so much prio in the early game. It's why Rogue has been considered such a slow team by the community throughout this year, is because these two just do not work together in that way, and Marcoon's going to fall because of it. I still, again, think Marcoon could potentially be a better player in a different circumstance, but he is a player that I'm more concerned about than Larssen. He's going to fall down to a C+. He was a B-graded player at the beginning of the year for me. He's just not that anymore. Then you've got Finn in the top lane. They brought him in before spring, after winter. And he's fine. He's the kind of player that, 2 or 3 games every single regular season, he's going to look amazing on things like Gangplank that he can just team fight on. But outside of that, you're going to have, 5 or 6 games where he's just completely irrelevant per split. He's not really the weak side player that he was when he first came up through Rogue. He's a lot more resource heavy than he has been before. That can generally be considered a positive for Rogue because they really don't have a lot of other places to put their resources other than top lane. But Finn's not the kind of player that's going to make or break your split. I think they brought him in with the expectation that he could be a bit more of a positive resource carry on the top side. He's just not better than a lot of the other top laners. A really strong position in the LEC right now, and Finn just comes in at number 9. He's a C+. He's a good starter. I just don't think he's a great starter, and I think he's proven that over the course of his career so far. And then Comp and Zoelise down in the bot lane, I think have pretty clearly proven to be the worst bot lane in the LEC right now. Comp has completely fallen off a cliff. I mean, this guy had a complete breakout year in 2022, was really good for a Rogue team that crazily overperformed, won the LEC, went to the quarterfinals of Worlds. Comp was a big reason why that team was so successful, but there has been no other year that Comp has played at a top level and actually looked competent. Back to Vitality, when you're going back to those days, he was not very good. In fact, I had him as the number 1080 carry coming into 2022 when he did break out, and then you look at 2023, and a lot of the problems from before that year ended up creeping back up. This year, he has been pretty atrocious in and out of lane. Comp has just proven to me that, honestly, that was a bit of a one-year wonder kind of performance from him, and until he shows literally anything else, I just don't have the confidence to say he's anything other than the weakest bot laner in the LEC, again, coming in at a C+ grade. And then Zoelise ranking as the lowest ranked player on this list, coming in as a C grade. He's just not been good at the LEC level. There's really nothing else to say. I think sometimes you can point to situation and say situation could be a problem. And again, if you're a really passive team like Rogue is, your support is just generally going to look worse. And so Zoelise isn't exactly in the best position to succeed, but he has not been good. He has lost a lot of games for this Rogue team by being out of position, by getting caught out, by having really bad laning splits, and just not generally being a positive for the team overall. He was never successful in the ERLs. He obviously came through that LDLC team, the last LDLC player to end up making the LEC, and they weren't particularly good in the LFL, so I just don't know if that situation is going to turn around. I would expect this to continue to be the worst bot lane in the league. I think mid-jungle is going to continue to be a nightmare in terms of early game pressure. I don't think Finn is consistent enough to be somebody that you can rely on to win you games at this level. I just don't think Rogue has a lot going for them, and especially, like I said, with basically every other team getting better in some facet, Rogue, to me, staying the same, not making any changes coming in from spring, clearly going to be the team that's at the bottom of the power rankings for me. I don't really see any reason for this team to get better unless they just completely evolve their playstyle, unless Marcoon suddenly becomes this early game PowerPoint jungler and Comp can completely turn it around and get back to 2022. Unless those things happen, I don't really see a lot of upside for Rogue, which is why, to me, they pretty clearly come in at the bottom of the rankings. But then moving on to number 9, this is the other team that I would expect to not make the playoffs here coming out of the regular season. Remember, top 8 make playoffs, or at least they make the best of 3 stage. The bottom 2 do not. So who's the other team that I do not expect to make it into that top 8 stage? Well, coming in at number 9 for me, it is going to be GIANTX. I feel pretty confident that this is the other team that should be considered in the bottom 2. I think it is a pretty clear bottom 2 for me. I shouldn't say that. Rogue is a clear bottom 1, and then I think GIANTX is a tier above that, but also clearly bottom 2, if that makes sense. Everybody else, I think, has some upside, has something to look forward to in terms of their output. I just don't think GX has that right now. I think that there is a strong case to be made that they got worse going into this split, and I don't really think that there's anybody on this team that I trust to be the primary carry. You're putting so much faith into some players that just have not shown all that much consistently over the course of this year, and that definitely raises some question marks. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like the Antonio in the top lane, Juhan in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Patrick at AD carry, and Ignar at support. One of the first actual teams to have some changes here. It allows me to explain some of the differences on the screen that you're seeing in the graphic. Of course, any asterisk next to a player's name will just indicate that they are, in fact, an import. You know, Ignar, Juhan, considered imports because they are from not the LEC. I think Ignar is technically NA, and Juhan is, of course, Korea. Then you'll have the number below that. I know I probably should have explained this on Rogue, but that's where I personally power rank them amongst their own position. The number in the parentheses will be how that has changed from last split to this split, and that is including the players that were on the team last split. So for Antonio, you know, it's a -3, even though Antonio wasn't playing last split, and that's because Otoamne was ranked as the number 7 top laner going into the spring split. Juhan gets a +1 because Peach was ranked as the number 8, etc., etc. That's just how it ends up going. It will be denoted whether or not that is a change in player with the asterisk next to the number, and then, of course, the grade at the bottom, which we've already explained. I probably should have explained that with Rogue, but you get it here at 16 minutes into the video. That being said, this is an okay team. I think that there are positives. The biggest positive is that they were better by the end of the spring split. They had gotten better in the final week. They ended up 3-0 at the end of the spring split. They got drawn into a really tough group and weren't able to make it out. They ended up finishing in 7th, 8th in the playoffs, which was to be expected. But this team was way better than expectations would indicate towards the end of spring, and I think that that is encouraging. That being said, I think you took away some of that positivity with some of the changes that you've made. We can talk about the changes first, starting with Antonio in the top lane. I'm actually a little bit higher on Antonio, I think, than what consensus seems to be. I think a lot of people are talking like he is clearly going to be a massive downgrade and that he's just kind of a guy that, you know, has been toiling away in the ERLs for a long time. And while that is true, this guy has been playing for forever. I can think back to at least like pre-pandemic, like 2019, he was playing in the LVP. Like this is not a new thing with him being on this Giants roster. He's been in this organization for forever. Finally getting that call up to the LEC. I think there is a reason to be skeptical about that because he's always just kind of been really good at that level. He's never been one of those top laners where it's like he has to be promoted to the LEC, but there's also reason to look back at the spring split of this year in 2024 and be like, actually, Antonio was probably the best player on that Giants team down in the LVP and was actually really influential towards them being remotely relevant at all, and his call-up, I think, is justified. He's finally going to get that opportunity. I don't know if he has the mechanical ceiling to ever really break through at this level. That's always been a bit of a question mark, but he's a good player, and I think he's going to have some matchups where he looks relatively strong. For now, he is going to rank relatively low. He comes in as a C because he has not proven at all, like, there are a couple ranges of outcomes for him. You know, you could see him become a pretty stable, solid top laner, and you could also see him just not be good enough to play at this level. I think both of those things are realistic, which is why he comes in as a C. It's why he comes in as the number 10 top laner, because this role is stacked at the LEC level, but I think Antonio will be fine. That would be my guess, is that he might not be a star for this team, but I think he'll be solid enough. It's just a problem going from Otoamne to Antonio. It's just you're never really going to be able to expect that to be an upgrade reasonably. And then you are bringing Juhan in here into the jungle. I think this is an upgrade, but a very marginal one. I think a lot of people are going to look at Juhan and say that this is a massive addition for GIANTX because he is a world champion. He's somebody who was theoretically like the sub on that DRX team that won Worlds in 2022, did play at that tournament, and honestly, he was the primary jungler for their qualification process to get to Worlds in the first place. A lot of people forget Pioshik was benched for a lot of the qualification process, a lot of the back half of that regular season in summer because he was just too volatile. They brought Juhan in because he was a much better Maokai and Sejuani player, a much better tank engage player, and that's going to be the reputation that he is going to continue to have. He was, I guess, generally fine in the LVP with, getting to play with Antonio, but he's not a star. He's not the kind of player that's going to come in and play these carry champions and really kind of push this team over the edge. He's a really good facilitative jungler, a really good, third piece to have on the team, and theoretically that could be possible if Antonio, if Patrick, if Jackie's, if one of those players takes a big leap, you could have Juhan as that facilitator to help kind of necessitate more resources in their direction. I just don't think Juhan is the kind of player that's going to come in and completely change the trajectory of your team if you don't have a lot of other carries. Very stable player, somebody who is known to be, very consistent on a game-to-game basis. That was always kind of the scouting report on him in Korea, but just kind of fine generally overall. Not really all that different from Peach. I think he's a better version of what Peach was for this team, but I don't think it's by a lot. It's why he's still only going to come in as the number 7 jungler as a B- grade. I think he's valuable, but I don't think he's a star for this team by any means. And then you've got the 3 players that are returning, starting with Jackie's in the mid lane. Jackie's has been an interesting conversation to have because he's on the trajectory that I think we all thought he would be on, or at least, I don't want to say best case scenario, but like a good trajectory for him, which is that he'll have a couple of games every single split where he looks really good, where he feels comfortable, where he's able to get early leads and actually keep his own, but it's just not going to be consistent at all on a game-to-game basis because he's simply too inexperienced at a top level of competition. When you're bringing a guy out of what is essentially tier 3 in the ERL system and putting him right into the LEC, he's going to have some growing pains, but I think there's been a lot of optimism for me surrounding some of his tape because the flashes absolutely have been there. That being said, they need him to be good. Like, they're investing a lot into him being a primary carry for this team in the mid lane because bot lane really isn't all that exceptional in terms of generating early resources. You've got a more facilitative, a more supportive jungler, and so Jackie's is actually being given a lot of responsibility on this team, and I just don't know if 2024 is the year that that's going to pay dividends. I could see him being really good in 2025 and kind of developing into that role as he gets more comfortable playing at the LEC level and growing into that, but I don't think he is there just yet, which is why he still comes in as a C+. The upside has clearly been there throughout this year. There's definitely been flashes where he's looked very solid, but again, game to game, can you rely on him to win games for your team? I just don't think so. And then Patrick and Ignar in the bot lane, they're fine. They're both going to come in at B-. I've been known to love Patrick on this channel. He's been a kind of channel darling for me over the course of the last 4 or 5 years or so that I've been talking about the LEC, but this bot lane has just kind of been okay. They've been inconsistent. Patrick, honestly, has played a little bit out of character across this year so far, and that's not to say that's always been bad, but he's been a lot more aggressive, and that means that there are games that he has lost a lot harder than he usually does. Typically speaking, what you're talking about with Patrick is a late game hyper carry, somebody who is really stable at being able to win team fights, but isn't exactly the most dominant laning AD carry. It's kind of been the opposite this year. He's had a couple of mistakes in 5v5s that have really cost this team, and if he is able to get going, if he is able to snowball, he can get the game out of control. It's been a really interesting development for him. Part of that is Ignar, who's just a lot more aggressive than a lot of the other supports that he's played with over the past couple of years, but I don't think this bot lane is exceptional. I don't think they're going to drag this team down. I think you can be an okay team with this bot lane, but they're not as good as I was kind of hoping they would be at the beginning of the year, and I think, again, it just goes back to GX just kind of being meh, right? They're okay. They're expecting a lot out of their young players. I do think that Jackie's needs to step up. He is going to be the tilting point for this team. If he can actually kind of realize that potential early, if he can speed up his trajectory, I think GX could be better than anticipated, but if he is what I think he's going to be, which is a player that's going to win you games and lose you games throughout the split, I just don't really see a lot of other avenues for GX to win without Odoamne here. Perhaps Patrick and Ignar figure it out this split, not really anticipating that. I think Juhan will be fine. He'll give you a pretty interesting output. I think maybe he looks a little bit worse than he actually is because of the team around him, and again, I think Antonio will survive a bit better in the top lane than people are anticipating, but I'm not really expecting any of these players to really stand out, which is why amongst a sea of LEC teams with interesting options and interesting players, I think GX unfortunately just comes in as one of the less interesting options and in the bottom 2 for me. But that's going to bring us to number 8 in my power rankings. These are the playoff teams, or at least my projected playoff teams, and coming in at number 8 is going to be a team that I think some people are going to see as too low after some of the changes, but it really is a to be determined for me. It's Karmine Corp. It's K Corp coming in at number 8. It's just really hard for me to rank them too much higher than this, not only because there are real question marks on this team as to whether or not they're going to live up to the expectations others have of them. There are players that I think are not surefire successes at this level. Like, there are definitely some question marks about whether or not players are going to step up. And also, this org and this coaching staff need to prove that they can win at this level. I know that that's a very surface level thing, and I think they will get it done, which is why I do have them coming out of the bottom 2. They were 10th, and to put them at 8, I think is definitely a sign that I think they are upgraded, but they have to prove that they can continue that trend of moving up, because last split was supposed to be that re-emergence. They were supposed to have made their changes, figured things out, and come out here and really made the most of it. That didn't happen, so I need to see that happen on the Rift before I just anoint them as a team that's guaranteed to be, you know, top 6, which I think a lot of people are really, you know, just kind of claiming this team is going to be. But I still like this team. Their upgrades are definitely still upgrades. They still definitely got better across the board. I just don't think it's as much as some people would like to make it out to believe. So we'll talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Kana in the top lane, Closer in the jungle, Vladi in the mid lane, Upset at AD carry, and Targamas at support. You got 2 members coming back here. Upset and Targamas are returning as a bot lane duo. This is part of my pessimism. I just don't think these two work all that well together. Targamas in particular has had a truly horrendous year so far. And, you know, I've been known to be a bit of a Targamas fan on this channel in the past when he was on G2. I thought he was a bit underrated for his success in 2022. In that year, I thought he was very integral towards how G2 wanted to play that game. And it didn't really feel like he got credit for that, but clearly outside of that system, things have not worked out. He was horrible on Excel last year. He's been significantly worse on KC this year, and so you're really just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I know they have Fleshy in KCB. You know, they're not afraid to promote from KCB, as we've seen multiple times already, but you know, Targamas to me is somebody who is on the shortest of leashes. He is the player that came the closest to getting like a C- grade of anybody in the LEC for me. Spoiler alert, nobody's going to get that grade. Nobody's a D or a C- level player, at least right now in the LEC, but Targamas is certainly the closest. The only reason he gets that C for me, that he stays out of that C- range, is because he has been good at this level in the past, but over the past 2 years, it's just not been there, and that's definitely a question mark that has not been answered. And then Upset, he's going to drop quite a lot. I know he's, you know, considered an equal from what he was going into spring, but remember, Upset has been pretty unanimously a top 2 or a top 380 carry in Europe for the past 5 years or something like that. Individually, his performances can still at times be good, but even then, those have started to trail off, and generally speaking, he has notoriously not found team success over the course of his career. He's been a part of a lot of 10th place teams, way too many 10th place teams to feel comfortable, and honestly, last split was the first time I really saw like the flaws of Upset, where it's just like not connecting with the rest of his team, not actually playing within tempo with everybody else, not being like communicative in terms of the team fights. Like, there will be moments where his mechanics are just carrying him through a lot of this and he can actually be really valuable, but there were multiple moments where the team just kind of left him to die because clearly he's not on the same page as the rest of them, and that's been a continuous trend over the course of his career. I do not feel super confident that this bot lane is going to get a ton better, which is why I still have some reservations about K-Corp, even if I do think the rest of this roster is better kind of across the board. So we'll talk about their promotion. First, Vladi coming into the mid lane. He's going to get a C+ grade. This is definitely better than what Seiken was. Vladi was really good in the spring split. It's just really hard to kind of get an idea of him. Now, Vladi, luckily for me, is a player that I've watched a lot of because the NLC is the easiest ERL to watch for someone who, like me, lives in America. Time zone-wise, it's just the easiest one to catch in the mornings, and so I actually saw quite a bit of Vladi in 2023 when he was playing in the NLC, but obviously went back and watched a lot of the LFL tape, went back and watched the U-Masters. The U-Masters did not go as they wanted it to, but Vladi was really good in the LFL from what I saw. It's just kind of difficult because KC Blue was just so talented. Like, there were so many good players on the team. There's obviously Kalist, but you've got Linsas, who's being promoted as well up into the LEC. You've got Fleshy, who we talked about potentially as another option. There are just so many good players on KC Blue that it makes his job a lot easier as a mid laner. He had a couple of great performances, and I'm not trying to take too much away from Vladi, but we have seen players play well in that system at that level before that have not been able to make the transition. There are shades of Seiken here, and obviously because Vladi has a little bit less of a track record than maybe some of the other mid laners who have been promoted at this level, there are some concerns. But if Vladi can come in and just be good, if he can be what Zviru was for Heretics last split, which I think is super doable, by the way, then I do think that is a significant upgrade. Seiken really struggled with confidence in the LEC. I talked about this a lot in the weekly reviews. His biggest problem is that he never tried to contest the enemy mid laner. He never went out there and was like, okay, I'm going to win. he went out there and was like, I'm not going to lose. And just bringing somebody into the room, somebody onto the Rift that is going to go out there and at least try to create some pressure in the mid game, I think will be an upgrade, which is why he's a C+. He's not a C, he's a good player. He was really good in spring. I just have questions about whether or not he's going to come in and be dominant. We've just seen too many ERL mid laners in particular come up and take some time to get adjusted to this level. So I am going to be a little bit cautious, but he could skyrocket up by the end of the year if he plays well. And then two quote-unquote imports. One, not considered an import, Closer in the jungle, is technically, I believe, EMEA. I think he is not an import. I don't think he ever became an NA player. I think he technically is from Turkey, so he still has that distinction. But they're bringing Closer in the jungle. I think this is a push between him and Bo. This is not a huge upgrade to me, and especially if you're getting the Closer that existed in 2023 on that 100 Thieves team, I think that's a downgrade, right? Closer was awful last year. He was horrible for 100 Thieves. He was a huge negative for that team. He was one of the biggest reasons they underperformed. His individual performances were really poor. However, I am going to cut him some slack in that regard because, and I know this feels like a cop-out, but double lift destroys junglers. Like, it just kind of is what it is, especially someone like Closer, who's a bit more of a carry jungler. He wants resources. He wants to go out there and play a little bit more, you know, with the game in his hands, as opposed to, you know, playing for his bot lane or for his mid lane or something like that. And double lift is not the kind of player that's ever going to be in a situation where he's anything other than the primary carry on a team, and so Closer definitely playing out of style. Worth noting, he was horrible in that style, but if he can just bounce back to even halfway between what he was in 2022 and 2023, he's going to be a good addition to this team. I think Bo was fine. I think they're similar players. I think Bo has a much higher mechanical ceiling, but Closer has a much higher floor in terms of what you're getting. Bo's going to have some games where he just completely runs it, some fights that he's just going to completely run even in good games, and Closer just doesn't really have those as much, or at least the Closer that you're hoping to get here. So I think it's fine. He's an okay player. I don't necessarily think I would have made this decision, but hopefully it helps communication. And then you're bringing Kana into the top lane. Now, this is definitely the most intriguing addition, if only because Kana has such a high ceiling if things end up working out. We've seen some people get imported from the LCK, especially players that have been successful at that level, that have been, you know, stars at that level at some time, and they've not exactly come over to the West and done particularly well. Typically speaking, when you see imports do well, it's young players that haven't necessarily proved their spot at a top level yet, but Kana not brought back by DK after last year, and so he's getting a shot here in the LEC. He was pretty good last year. I think a lot of people are going to look at some of the highlights and say that he wasn't, because you look at Reddit, and Reddit said that he was bad, but Reddit is very critical of teams that have popular players or popular teams, and so Kana, for the most part, being only the third best top laner in the LCK in 2023 was kind of a disappointment to DK fans, but I thought Kana was pretty good, an all-pro-ish caliber player in the LCK. He's not a superstar. He's really not someone that you want as your primary option. It's not kind of his playstyle. He can carry games. He can definitely receive resources if you want him to do that. I just wouldn't necessarily say that he's like Photon in terms of what you can expect as a carry presence in the top lane, but a very stable player, somebody who is going to be able to win 1v1, who is a very good team fighter, who is somebody who can really fit into the confines of a team. If there's no communication problem, which I think is definitely the first hurdle that you have to overcome with an import, as long as there's no problems getting him comfortable or, you know, communicating in any way, shape, or form, then I think Kana is going to be a good addition. He's going to come in as my number 4 top laner right now. That could go up depending on how good he is immediately. Some people are going to see this as way too low, but again, you just don't know how somebody is going to adapt to going to an entirely new culture and an entirely new region. We've seen really good players go to other regions and just not be able to adapt, even though they are mechanically talented enough to be able to beat everybody there. You just don't know what those performances are going to look like on stage. So I wanted to find somewhere in the middle. Clear B+. You can't go much lower than that for someone like Kana, but I think number 4, with how good the top 3 top laners are in the LEC, I think that that's pretty respectable. So, and that's definitely an upgrade, by the way. They've not had a good top lane situation throughout this year, so this is a better team. That is definitely the case. I think Vladi will add some stability to the mid lane position, hopefully. I think Kana is definitely an upgrade in the top lane. Closer, I think, is a push, maybe a higher floor, which I think might be good for this team. But those are just concerns, right? It's not like this team has been entirely rewritten to be a top contender. Upset and Targamas are still a question mark. Vladi has not proven anything at this level. You don't know how Kana's going to come in. Closer was horrible last year. There are question marks everywhere across this roster, which is why I'm not just guaranteeing that this team is going to be top 6 like a lot of other analysts will. I see the upside. I see the potential for this team to have by far their best showing across 2024 so far, but I want to see it on the Rift first. I want to see these 5 work together in a cohesive and strong way before I just anoint them as a team that's definitely going to be a contender right now. And then moving on to number 7 for me. 7 is definitely where it starts to get a little bit more, okay, well, you've proven something, but there are still major question marks. If this team finished in the bottom 2, I would not be surprised. I think anybody in the bottom 4 could theoretically get bottom 2 if everything goes wrong for them, and that includes number 7 for me, SK Gaming. I think a lot of negativity has been tossed around with this team, but I think there are still too many positives and too many knowns for me to say that they are a disaster, to say that they are definitely going to be a team that I project in the bottom 2, like I think a lot of other analysts are doing right now. But I could definitely see a world in which things do bottom out, even if they do have some good performances from some of their members. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Irrelevant in the top lane, Isma in the jungle, Niski in the mid lane, Rahel at AD carry, and Luan at support. I believe it's Luan because he went by HH in the LCK Challengers League. We will get to this bot lane, bringing in 2 LCK Challengers League players to replace Exakick and DOS on this team is certainly a bold decision. And in fact, why don't we start with them? Because they're certainly the biggest topic of conversation when it comes to SK. I actually don't think they're going to influence this team's like success or non-success all that much. Exakick and DOS really weren't all that relevant towards whether or not this team won or lost games last split either. They were not that good, and it didn't really matter if they won or lost. It just kind of was what it was. But Rahel and Luan coming in, I think, offer kind of a different thing. I like Exakick and DOS a lot as a duo. I think DOS in particular developed a lot when he was in the LEC. He got a lot better split over split. Exakick, somebody who kind of did the opposite, kind of got worse split over split, which is definitely a worrying trend, which is why they opted to move in a different direction. But bringing in Rahel and Luan is hopefully this idea that you're just going to increase the ceiling of what this bot lane can offer. Rahel was amazing in the playoffs for DK Challengers. There's really no other way to put it. Going and watching their finals run, obviously, they lost in the finals to KT Challengers, who was just by far the best team in the Challengers League. It wasn't even particularly close, but for DK to get there and for Rahel to be kind of the driving force, at least in the playoffs, was really important for this team. Saint was really good as well, their mid laner, but Rahel was definitely kind of the guy to watch on that team, and that gives me some confidence that he's got some extra X factor coming over here. We've seen players who have not necessarily succeeded at the LCK level come over to Europe and be really successful. Players like Noah and Ice come to mind, players that are going to be pretty high on this list. The problem is it's just really hard to be able to project that. Rahel is one of the more mechanically talented players to come over. In fact, I think as a prospect, he's better than both Noah and Ice were coming in here, which is why he's going to get a B- grade. I don't think I gave either of them that high of a grade in their first split, but again, you just don't really know. You have to show some caution when it comes to players who have, first of all, never played at a top level, but also are going to an entirely different culture and region. It's just really difficult to project whether or not they're going to be able to make that transition all that seamlessly. I think Rahel is a really good addition, though, mechanically speaking. He is just straight up better than Exakick, and I imagine this will be an upgrade. AD carry is just one of those positions where you have a big cluster of people, and Rahel's relative inexperience is going to land him at the bottom of that, but he could easily be 1 or 2 by the end of the split in terms of AD carry rankings. I don't want you to see the number 9 on the screen and think that I'm somehow like trying to disrespect Rahel. I just want to be cautious with these numbers. And then Luan, obviously renaming from HH, he was on Nongshim's Challengers team. They were interesting to watch. They were such a bot lane focused team that obviously he had such a high responsibility. Vital was really the carry for that team throughout the entirety of the year, and he was amazing in the playoffs. Vital was awesome. Luan was doing a really good job of being able to support him. That bot lane is definitely where Nongshim wanted to put a lot of their resources. That's kind of the case for the LCK team as well. But he's even more inexperienced when it comes to long-term success at the Challengers League level. He is definitely more of a punt on somebody who was just really good this past spring. And again, if that hits, that's a really big positive, but you just don't really know what you're going to get out of him. I think this is very similar to how I viewed Supa and Alvaro coming into the year for Mad Lions. I had a pretty good idea that they were going to be good at this level, but I just needed to see him. I needed to see them pop off at the LEC level before I just kind of crowned them one of the better bot lanes, and they went and did that, and I think they've proven that they are at least a contender for one of the better bot lanes in Europe right now. I think Rahel and Luan could absolutely be that very quickly here for SK. I don't think it's guaranteed, especially because it's not exactly the best surrounding, situation. So, bot lane is a positive, but it's definitely more of a wait and see positive than it is like guaranteed to be a massive upgrade for this team. And then the rest of this roster I think is actually kind of interesting. I still have faith in Niski. I know I'm maybe alone on that. Everybody seems to have completely given up on him, but people have hated Niski for as long as I've been watching League for absolutely absurd reasons. Has he been perfect this year? Absolutely not. He has not been nearly as good this year as he was the past 2 years on Mad Lions. That is just the truth. He was an MVP caliber player on Mad, and he's not been an MVP caliber player on SK. But has he been a disaster? I don't really think so. I think he's been generally fine. His laning stats have been bad, but that was never his strength anyways. If you're expecting him to be the guy that is the best player on a team like SK that can carry them into top 4, then I don't know what you're watching. Like, I don't know who you think Niski is as a player. His best role is to be that second or third option that can then open up the rest of the map to be a lot more free. And that was actually showcased to be kind of the truth at the beginning of the year. He was making Isma look amazing. Irrelevant's job was a lot easier. The problem is teams realized that if you could take away Isma, that Niski really didn't have anybody else to help out in that same vein. Hopefully the bot lane can step up and that can be better for SK, but all of these people that are just so ready to give up on Niski, it's just crazy to me. This guy has been too good for too long for me to look at, one down split really in the spring, because he was good in winter, and, he was really genuinely like a top 5, 4-ish mid laner in winter. He had one down split in spring, and now everyone's like, he shouldn't even be starting in the league. I know LEC fans are reactionary, but it just feels very extreme to me. I'm definitely not willing to give up on Niski just yet. And then you've got Isma, like I was talking about. Great start to winter. I mean, he was player of the week in week 1 of the LEC in winter this year. He was really dominating. It looked like he was on his way to becoming that next LEC jungler to kind of break through. And then things just completely fell apart. He has been getting worse and worse and worse as the year has gone along. It feels like a lot of those early aggressive plays that he was making that kind of set him apart from a lot of other players are being taken away from him. And he doesn't really do a lot of the other things at a super high level. One of the things that really separated him was that early aggressiveness, was his level 3 ganks that were so successful, especially in the bot lane in the winter split. Once those stopped happening, even towards the end of the winter split, and especially like all of spring, he just kind of became a jungler, and at a kind of below average one at that. And so I don't have a ton of confidence in Isma going into summer. Hopefully he can turn some things around. Perhaps if this team does speed up their pace of play once again, that could help him out a lot. I don't think he's ever really going to function well in a slow-paced team. He needs to be on a team that's going to be super active throughout a majority of the early game, but if they are going to transition more into that, I think that will help Isma just across the board. But moving to the final player, Irrelevant up in the top lane. He's probably the most stable player on this team and the one that I'm going to get the most criticism on when it comes to his individual ranking. He is going to get a B+ grade for me. I think he is a B+ player. You're going to see a lot of people in the LEC community talk about Irrelevant as if he's a top 1 or a top 2 top laner in the league, and I just don't see that on tape, and I'm sorry. I know there are going to be a lot of people that really feel frustrated by that, but I know B+ is supposed to represent the consistent players, but Irrelevant is inconsistent. That is just kind of generally the only thing holding him back, is that he'll have quite a few games where he's just not good. Like, he'll have 2 or 3 games every single split where he's not particularly good. The difference between him being a B+ and a B, even though he is inconsistent, is the fact that his highs are just better than the other B+ and Bs. Like, as a high, he's an A-graded player. He's a top 1, top 2 top laner. He's going to have some performances per split where you're like, he just dominated, a really good player. He is a top 1 or top 2 player. You're going to have 1 or 2 games, but when you watch every game, when you get a full sample size of Irrelevant, there's just too much bad to try and overlook and to say that he is as valuable to his team as someone like a Broken Blade or someone like a Photon is to their individual teams. Again, I still think Irrelevant's very good. He comes in as the highest graded player on this team as a B+. He is the best player on SK Gaming, and if they're going to win a lot of games, I think a lot of it is going to be through Irrelevant. He is the primary win condition for this team. He has been throughout an entirety of this year. He's been an MVP level player for them, and it's funny because I was always an Irrelevant defender going back, last year and the year before. I loved him on Misfits. I thought he was super good for this team last year, and now that everybody's waking up to him, now I'm the one that's crazy just because I haven't changed my grade from what he has been over the past 2 years. This has always been who Irrelevant has been. I just feel like I was early to the trend, and now I'm considered a hater. So it is what it is. This is the life and dichotomy of an analyst that covers esports, especially in a region that is so interesting in terms of fan reaction to player developments. But to summarize, SK Gaming, not the most wowing team in the entire world, but there is the potential for this bot lane to be incredibly strong. Rahel, Luan, I think, could be a very good bot lane at this level. They could be a top 2, top 3 bot lane in the LEC, which would immediately raise the floor of this team. I think Niski is overhated. I think Irrelevant's a really good player. My only real question marks are Isma, who's definitely going to be the biggest question mark on this team for me, and then whether or not Rahel and Luan can perform like that at a top level, in a top tier region. So it'll be interesting to see, but SK, I think, definitely has a bit more going for them than other analysts might make out to believe right now. And then moving on now to top 6. This is really where it starts to get into those teams that I think are genuinely good. Teams that I think have a shot at being able to qualify for Worlds if everything were to go right. Again, I don't think 6 is going to do that. In fact, I think top 3 for me feel pretty clear in terms of my expectations, but again, I think anybody from this point onwards could theoretically qualify for Worlds, and I wouldn't be entirely surprised if, everything starts to click for them. And coming in at number 6 for me, unfortunately, at the bottom of that, it is going to be Team Heretics. I think some people might want to see this team higher. Some people might think this is appropriate for them. I think this is appropriate for them. I think this is what I would expect them to end up landing at, especially with how they performed so far this year, but just a few too many question marks for me in terms of the fit with some of the players around the rest of this team for me to feel entirely confident that they're just going to surpass anything they've done already this year. There are some good moments in the regular season, especially in spring, but the playoffs once again showed that this team is fundamentally flawed. This should not have been a team that went out before top 4, and they did anyways. And so, we'll kind of explain why I think that was a bit disappointing, but their lineup is continuing to look like Wunder in the top lane, Jankos in the jungle, Zviru in the mid lane, Flacket at AD carry, and Trimby at support. This is still a very good lineup. This is still a very well-rounded lineup, which I think is definitely the positive, although there are a few more concerns here than there were, at the beginning of the year or even going at the beginning of the spring split for me. We can actually go top to support on this one, though, since they're all returning, starting with Wunder in the top lane. Some people might see 7 and see that as outrageous, but remember, Kana and Irrelevant are B-plus players, and they came in at 4 and 5. For me, top lane is just ridiculously stacked at the LEC level. There are so many good top laners in the LEC that being a B-graded player means you're going to be closer to 7 than you are to number 3, and that's just not the case in a lot of other regions. And so Wunder, unfortunately, kind of suffers from that. He is going to fall a bit in terms of the rankings because the position got even better this offseason with Kana kind of coming in and taking one of those upper tier spots, but Wunder has just kind of been a guy throughout this year. He's really not separated himself. I think we were all expecting him to come in and be very good, not only because it's Wunder and he's one of the most legendary top laners that the LEC has ever seen, but because basically every time he has played, even in recent memory, he's been good. I was a big Fnatic Wunder defender when he was playing full-time for them in 2022. He obviously wasn't playing full-time in 2023 after the winter split, but when he did come in for that, lower bracket run in the, was it the championship, the finals, the season finals, whatever it's called, at the end of the year for Fnatic when Oscar Rinnan was injured, he was actually really good for the team in that run, and so I expected him to come into Heretics, especially getting to play with a couple of players that he was comfortable with, in Jankos and Perks, and I thought it was going to work out. I thought he was going to re-emerge as one of the best top laners in the LEC. That has not happened so far in 2024. He's just kind of been a guy for this team, and at this point, I guess that's kind of what we have to accept him to be. He's been a good laner, not a great laner, just kind of an okay, a league average laner, and he's really not separated himself a ton in team fights. He's not been a problem for this roster. He's not losing them games. He's never really been the issue here, but he's also not winning as hard as a lot of other top laners at this level are, and especially with competition being so fierce in that role, having a player who's just kind of average, it's really not all that much of an asset right now for Heretics. And so Wunder simply has to get better. This has to be the split where he gets back to where he was before, he was benched by Fnatic, and then you are looking at positives in a lot of other areas. Jankos is the biggest positive on this team by far. He's going to come in as an A-. Our first A-graded player to make this list. Unfortunately, Jankos having that distinction, but he was the MVP for me in the spring split. I know that was a bit of a controversial take. I thought he was the most valuable player to his individual team in the regular season. Remember, MVP is a regular season award, and to me, Jankos was the most valuable. Caps was the best player, and we'll definitely talk about that, but Jankos with a really good turnaround. He was actually kind of poor in winter, which definitely gave me some concern, but it turns out a lot of that was Perks. Perks was just not very good for this Heretics team. He was a massive negative for them overall, and getting him out, getting Zviru in, who at times was, kind of poor, but for the most part was very stable, very solid for them, just allowed Jankos to do his thing once again, and he was, again, the focal point for how Heretics wanted to play the game. It felt a lot more like 2023 for Jankos than it did winter split, which is a good thing. Because of that MVP split, he's going to jump up back to number 2 for me. I think numbers 1 through 4 in the jungle rankings are super volatile. You guys know who the top 4 junglers are in the LEC. You don't need me to tell you who the top 4 junglers are in the LEC. You can put those 4, I think, in almost any order that you want, and I would feel pretty okay with that. Jankos for me comes in at number 2. If you wanted him at 1, great. If you wanted him to stay at number 4 because Heretics is the weakest of those teams, go ahead. I don't really have a huge issue with that. I think 1 to 4 is all pretty close. So Jankos coming in at number 2 for me is kind of splitting the difference here, giving some credence and some credit to that MVP season while also not going too far overboard for me. And then you've got Zviru in the mid lane. I think for the most part, there was more good than bad in his first split in the LEC. I think that is definitely an encouraging sign. He played off of Jankos significantly better than someone like Perkz did, who just was way too aggressive. Zviru definitely more willing to take a backseat in terms of the resources that he was getting on that team, but still can carry games if necessary. We actually saw quite a bit of that in the playoffs in the best of 3 stage, where he was a lot better for this team. If he continues that upward trajectory, he's going to be a B grade, B plus graded player by the end of this split. I feel pretty confident in that. 8 might seem a little low because Zviru is good, and there are players above him in these rankings that were worse than him last split. Niski and Larson definitely come to mind. They were in no way, shape, or form better than Zviru, but I think a lot of it has to do with situation. I think Zviru's job is a lot easier than Larson's right now, and I think it's all just up to personal preference. They get the same grade for me. I think Zviru will outperform Larson and probably will outperform someone like Niski this split because his team is better and he's going to be given more opportunities and resources, and he gets to play with Jankos as his jungler. But, I think relatively speaking, if you were to swap these situations, I don't know if Zviru would be as strong on Rogue. You know what I mean? I think it's just kind of that situation. So, pardon if he's not as high as maybe some other analysts would like him to be, but at a B- grade, bordering on a B, I think this is still relatively fair. And then you've got the bot lane, Flacket and Trimby. When they brought Trimby in the midseason after winter, my first reaction to that, as I said on Twitter, as I said here on the channel, was, oh, they clearly want to play towards Flacket more, because what Trimby does really well is lane, is 2v2 lane. That's his big strength as a player. Not only is he a great shot caller, but his laning mechanics are actually very strong. He is the best laner in the support position in the LEC, and so when you bring that in, you're expecting Flacket to actually be a priority in the early game, and that was kind of true. I'm definitely kind of in on Flacket. I think he's actually a really good AD carry right now, and he's somebody who could emerge as a top 2, top 3 AD carry. I think he slots really nicely in as a B-graded, inconsistently very good AD carry that can win you some games, is definitely going to be a positive for a majority of the split, but is at times going to get lost in the shuffle. I think that that's a pretty accurate and fair way to discuss Flacket, but Trimby, on the other hand, I think is generally someone who can push that over the top. We didn't necessarily see it in the spring split. This bot lane was just kind of okay, but when it worked, it really worked, and if they continue to grow, if you give them a bit more time to get to practice together. Remember, they got, very little practice time before the spring split started, and so they probably weren't as prepared to play as a duo as they will be going into summer. I expect this bot lane to be better, which is why Trimby comes in at number 2, and this is a good segue into the support rankings. Numbers 1 through 5, I think all have the same grade. I think there's a big B+ cluster in terms of supports at the LEC level. Trimby comes in at number 2. If you wanted him at number 4 or 5, based off his performance last split, honestly, I do kind of understand. It's all just up to personal preference. Trimby's track record leads me to believe that this will get better because he is the kind of player that just amplifies the players that he plays with, and I like Flacket, and I think this bot lane is going to improve, which is why I have Trimby at number 2. This is where I'm expecting him to perform this split, but again, there are so many variable ranks in terms of the LEC. It's so difficult to nail down where exactly some of these players land. But bot lane should be a positive. I think jungle should be a positive. Mid lane's going to be fine for this team. Top lane's fine for this team. But there are a few too many question marks, and it is a bit concerning that your best player is Jankos. And I know that that's weird to say because Jankos, arguably a top 5 player in the LEC, but Jankos is not the kind of player that can be your best player and you win the LEC. And I don't mean that in a negative way towards Jankos and his skill level. His skill level is up there. It's just not the play style level. You need a hyper carry on this team. You need someone to be able to receive the resources that Jankos is so good at generating for his teammates. We're hoping that can be Flacket. I think realistically that's who they're hoping it can be as well. But Zviru, Wonder, somebody's got to step up and be the primary carry for this team. I'm expecting it to be a little bit more variable. Again, this is a team that has underperformed throughout this year, and I am kind of factoring that into the power ranking grade, but this should be a team that at the very least tries to compete for a top 3 spot. And then moving into number 5, this is going to be my final projected team to not make that top 4, to not make that best of 5 stage here in the summer split. I think this one was definitely the most difficult cutoff for me because I think 4 through 6 in particular is very close, but coming in just outside of the top 4 at number 5 for me, it is going to be Mad Lions Koi. I have them coming in at number 5. I think this is a pretty fair landing spot, all things considered for them. This is still a team that I value super highly and that I think could really overperform the ranking that I have given them here, or, really kind of show up and show out and be a top 3 team if everything goes right, but there are just a few too many question marks for me on this team in terms of consistency to really believe believe that they are guaranteed to do that. I think we saw in Winter what could happen when everything goes right, when the rest of the league doesn't necessarily keep up with some of the aggressive plays that Mad is going for. But, you know, on the flip side, we also saw in Spring what happens when teams do kind of answer a lot of those more aggressive plays, when those 50-50s aren't exactly flipping in your direction. So which version of that are we going to get? It's really to be determined, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Mirwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Fresskowy in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. Some of these numbers are going to look absolutely insane, and I definitely understand that. Once again, the LEC is a very weird region to try and rank in terms of players. It's really the only one where I look at some of the numbers and I go, man, that can't be right. Like, that number is too low or that number is too high. And, you know, I then look at the rankings and I'm like, yeah, I can't really move them around. I can't really change this all that much. But, you know, we'll go ahead and explain them. One of the first ones that I want to touch upon is actually the bot lane here, because this is a great example of what I mean when I say that not all positions are created equal. Supa and Alvaro have the exact same grade for me. They are identical players in terms of talent, in terms of skill level, at least in terms of how I have graded them out. They are equal, but Supa comes in as the number 2 AD carry, Alvaro comes in as the number 5 support. It just goes to show you there aren't a lot of AD carries that can play at a top level. There aren't a lot of AD carries that I trust to really dominate games. There are quite a few supports that at least have the potential to play at a really high level or have performed really well recently, and you know, we'll talk about them as we continue to move along, but these two players are equal in terms of grades. They're both B pluses and they're both the same scale of B plus. It's just AD carry's a lot weaker at the LEC level, and so Supa ends up getting graded out a lot higher, or his number ends up being a lot higher. But I'm a big fan of this bot lane. I have said this a lot on this channel. I know it's a bit of a meme that, you know, Supa went out and said that they're the best bot lane in the LEC, but they're really not all that far off from that. They're not the best bot lane in the LEC. They're not number 1, but they have an argument to be made that they are number 2. They're at least in the conversation. In terms of consistency, there are going to be some games that they lose, but especially at this level, like in this region, in the West in particular right now, name me 4 bot lanes that don't actively lose games for their team, like in the West. It just doesn't exist, right? You have to take the good with the bad when it comes to curtain AD carries, curtain supports, right now, in the LEC, in the LCS. And Supa and Alvaro, I think, are more consistent than a lot of other bot lanes at this level. They're going to give you a pretty good output most of the time. Talent-wise, mechanics-wise, they are probably the second best bot lane in the region. I think the only other bot lane that's going to compete with them at that level, you know, not counting G2, is probably going to be BDS, which we'll talk about, but I think Mad honestly has it in terms of mechanics. And so for upside, Supa's going to come in at number 2, Alvaro's going to come in at number 5. Alvaro could finish as the top 1 support. Like, that's reasonable. He is in that conversation. Supa could become the number 1 AD carry in the region by the end of the year. I think both of those things are possible. I'm not necessarily expecting that to happen. It's still very early on in their careers, but they have proven to be game breakers at this level, game wreckers, and I would expect that to continue. They are the strength of this Mad Lions team, and they still have a superstar in the jungle in Elyoya. I know he's fallen down a bit. He's gone from the perennial A or A- graded player that I've had him at throughout the majority of his career to a B+. I don't think his individual performances this year have lived up to what he has been over the past few years for this Mad Lions team, but at worst, he's still one of the elite junglers in the region. I talked about numbers 1 through 4 in jungle being all exceptional. Like 1 to 4, you could put them in almost any order. Elyoya started my year as number 1 in that jungle position. I think it's reasonable to say that he can get back there. It's just some of the individual performances, some of the inconsistencies have been a bit more on display than they have been in previous years, and I think that's concerned me a bit, but he's still a beast. I mean, this guy is still going to be a hugely positive part of this team. Elyoya plus Supa plus Alvaro is a very scary trio, one of the scariest in the entire league. I do have some concerns when it comes to the solo laners, but they're still good players. They come in ranked as B-graded players. These are still players you can win the LEC with. Fresskowy's going to be the one that I feel better about. He's going to come in as my number 6 mid laner in the entire region. I think you could even rank him higher than this. Again, he comes in 1 spot below Niski, if only because Niski has the track record, but Fresskowy has been better than Niski in 2024. I think you could even make a reasonable argument he's been around top 3, top 4. He's actually been very good for this team, and I think it's reasonable to say that he could continue to get better and continue to get even more active on the map. He feels like he's getting more confident. He is going to, again, have some games where he just isn't very good. That's what happens with young players, and generally that's just what happens with LEC players. There's really not a lot of players in this region that are good every single game, but Fresskowy has entirely exceeded my expectations. He's been a positive almost every single game, and I think, again, if that trajectory continues, he has gotten better. If he continues to get better, he's going to get up to number 3 or number 4, and I think it's very reasonable to say that he can perform like that this split. So I don't want anyone to look at this number and say that I'm downgrading him too much. He actually factored really well into the grade that I ended up putting out, and he's a big reason why Matt actually ends up at 5th instead of 6th for this team. But then you've got Mirwin in the top lane. People love Mirwin. Like, I get it. He's a super flashy, super fun player to watch. There are going to be some games again where he looks incredible, but he is the definition of why I said B is what it is, an inconsistently very good player. Because even more so than other players that I think are comparable, like Irrelevant, I think Mirwin's bad games are horrible. Like, they're truly terrible. He will actively lose 3 or 4 games for Mad Lions throughout a year, and that includes the best of 3s. He had that awesome run in winter in those best of 5s where he was dominating people and looking great, and his mechanics were coming through, and people were not ready for his counter picks. But go look at a lot of the spring split tape, especially in the regular season. He was being taken off of a lot of these weird counter picks. Twisted Fate was no longer this, like, niche underground pick that nobody knew how to deal with, and he wasn't allowed a lot of these other weird, niche counter picks, a lot of the things that we saw out of him, and he was one of the weaker top laners in the league. Like, when he had to play actual top laners, it just didn't work out nearly as well, and so there is still a major question mark for me when it comes to Mirwin. Do I think he has the mechanical ceiling to be able to move up this list? Absolutely, he does, but he comes in just behind Wunder. Like, it's really hard to find space earlier on in this list for someone like Mirwin, who I do think is very good, just inconsistent and very, very variable, very up and down in terms of the performances that he is going to give you. Again, I think his floor is very, very low. It's way overvalued. His ceiling is super high, but the range of outcomes for Mirwin is extreme, and that's why he does rank a bit lower, because I do value consistency a bit more than maybe your average analyst. And because of that, this team does come down to number 5. I do think it's reasonable to say this is a quote-unquote clear top 4 team if some of the things that I'm worried about don't end up coming to fruition. If Elyoya is a top 1 or 2 jungler, which is super realistic, then I think that it's reasonable to say that, Mad Lions could be top 4 easy. If Fresskowy and Mirwin are top 5 in their role, then I think it's fair to say that Mad is probably top 4 easy and can compete for top 3. But those things have to go right, and I'm just not entirely sure that those things are guaranteed to go right for a team that I think is relying on them. So I like Supa and Alvaro, I like Elyoya a lot, Fresskowy has impressed me a ton, but there are just a few nagging things in the back of my head that lead me to put this team at number 5. This is still a very good placement, though, and again, if this team ended up making a world spot, actually going on a run and being a top 3 team, I'm not really going to be all that surprised. It's just hard for me to predict that right now. But now we get to jump into our top 4. And top 4 is definitely a very interesting conversation to have. Again, top 4 is the best of 5 stage, but top 3 is Worlds for the LEC. And so top 4 isn't good enough. You have to be able to make that leap. I do think that, like I said, this team is capable of making that, but I'm not predicting them to. Coming in at number 4 for me, it is going to be Team Vitality. And I really do think this is the final team in this cluster of, like, good but maybe not elite level teams that have issues somewhere across the board. I don't feel entirely confident that they're going to be as good as the best teams in the league from a consistency perspective, but they are pretty damn close. And Vitality to me comes the closest of any of those other teams. They finished top 4 last split. They got 4th, and it was a pretty rough 4th. Like, it took a little bit of luck for them to get there, right? They had to face Mad Lions in that final series. I think they probably lose to either Fnatic or Team Heretics on the other side of that bracket, and so I think they're going to feel pretty good that they got top 4 and, pretty lucky in that situation, but I think that might have only been the start for them. They got better this offseason. They made one change, new jungler coming in, which we will talk about. I do think it's an upgrade, and you're just hoping you're going to get more consistency out of the rest of these players. There is too much talent on this team for you not to be in contention for a world spot. It is still yet to be determined whether or not that is going to be the case, but they should at the very least be in the running. Their lineup is looking like Photon in the top lane, Linsas in the jungle, VTO in the mid lane, Karzi at AD carry, and Hillisang at support. This is a very fun roster. We'll start with Linsas in the jungle because he is the new addition. He's kind of the hot new topic here for Vitality. I think this is a great addition. Linsas should not have been in the LFL to start this year. There really was no excuse after last year on Go, where he was simply too good on that team for him to be going into 2024 without an LEC offer. There were even rumors and reports that he was going to be going to NA for a lot of this offseason. It really felt like he was going to get a tier 1 offer somewhere as a starting jungler. Didn't end up happening. He ended up signing for KC Blue, which was obviously a really good decision. A lot of really good players on that team, a lot of players that are going to be playing in the LEC next year. Vladi obviously already playing right now, but Kalist, you're just waiting for him to turn 18 so he can play for K-Corp next year. He had a lot of talent on that roster, and he himself performed pretty well. Wasn't exactly the focal point, wasn't exactly the hero carry for the team, but was still a very big piece for what they were doing, and I think generally he should be an upgrade here. His mechanics are very sound, very solid, very smart player. I think he's just an upgrade to almost every facet of the game up to Douglas. Like, Douglas actually kind of impressed me in terms of what I was expecting. He was just kind of fine. Like, he was an average jungler, which I think was good for this team because they had above average talent in a lot of other positions, but I think Linsas has the potential to be better than that. I know he comes in at number 9. I know it's a B-. I know it doesn't necessarily look great, but this is a pretty complimentary ranking, all things considered. Again, jungler's really strong at this level. I do think this is an upgrade from having probably the worst jungler in the league to now a jungler that I think has top 5 upside if everything were to go right. It's just really difficult in this position. Again, a very strong position in the LEC. So Linsas an upgrade. Everybody else pretty solid. I can't quit VTO. That's probably the one ranking everyone's going to look at and say is a little bit crazy here. He's still going to come in as my number 3 mid laner. I know it feels insane, like, to put him over even someone like Frescowy, who was probably on his level, this past year. Frescowy comes in at 6, VTO comes in at 3. Like, does that feel fair? I don't know. VTO was so amazing in the winter split. He was really kind of the carry for Vitality. Once this team got better, once there were more resources, I guess, to be passed around, once the team felt more comfortable, his role kind of diminished, but that didn't necessarily, to me, feel like him playing worse. It more so felt like Vitality just having more options and him not needing to be the hyper carry, the one to win every single game for them, like he did in the winter split. I still think VTO can be an elite level mid laner at this level. He's still going to come in as a B. Like, this isn't some B+, like, A caliber player. Like, I'm acknowledging the faults of VTO. He's not the most consistent player in the world. This is not Misfits VTO. He has never really gotten back to that form ever since he's left Misfits. He certainly didn't get back to it last year, and it's not really been the case this year either. But his 2024 has been much better than his 2023, and I think the number 3 definitely accounts for that. He is a strength for this team. He's a reason why they were able to make top 4. And then you've got Photon in the top lane, the other solo laner, and to me, he's the best player on this team. I will continue to go to bat for Photon. His mechanics are just simply better than basically everybody else in the region. Like, top lane is a super contentious position. There are so many good top laners in the LEC, and yet Photon continues to emerge as the one that continues to stand out. He's going to get an A- grade from me. This might be considered high by some other analysts, but I just don't really see any other way to put this. Photon is one of the few players that I think can, win MVP, be a primary carry, and still stay super consistent on the top side of the map. Super elite player. Vitality is super happy to have him. He was a phenomenal pickup from the Challengers League. We've seen a lot of teams continue to try to replicate the process that Vitality had going out and getting Photon, and even going out and getting Bo. And no team has found that same level of success. Photon has really been an outlier at that level. He is an amazing player, and he has lived up to the hype. And then Carzzy and Hilly. Yes, they are going to be incredibly inconsistent, both of them coming in as B-graded players, but they are valuable. Carzzy coming in as the number 4 AD carry. He's clearly the best of that middle cluster to me. If fans would have you believe that he is in the upper cluster. He has a very passionate fan base because he is such a likable player. I have to go from what I see on tape, not so much what I hear in interviews. And to me, on tape, Carzzy's going to have some games where he just completely pops off and looks amazing, and some games where he runs it and is horrible. He's had multiple of those this year that I think a lot of people just like to ignore. In every single one of my awards videos, like at the end of the regular season when I kind of recap everything, I've had a lot of comments that are like, I actually would have put Carzzy as my number 1 AD carry. And to me, I get it because, there are most of the games that he plays are amazing, but it's almost like selective memory with the games where he is bad, where people just forget that there are 1 or 2 games where he plays like the worst AD carry in the entire universe. And I just can't account. That can't be a B+ player for me. Like, it's just really difficult for me in that regard. Most of his games are good at this point, and I do think he's been a positive, all things considered, for Vitality. But again, I can't have that selective memory when I come to rate him here. There are just 4 or 5 games so far in 2024 that are, completely abhorrent, like completely unplayable for Carzzy, and that's what keeps him out of the top 3 for me. And then Hylissang rebounded better, I would say, after his horrendous winter split. Hilly always has those bad splits. I told people to pump the brakes on the hate after winter. I actually got a lot of good feedback from that, which I was surprised by because it felt like the community was very against him. But Hilly's always going to have a couple of bad splits every once in a while because of how aggressive and how volatile he is as a player. You can count on him to bounce back, though. He's not the kind of player whose mental is just going to go on a nosedive. He feels comfortable making those plays even if they haven't been working for him. He's going to be able to bounce back mentally. And him and Carzzy do have that good synergy. It was brought brought over from Mad Lions last year. I don't think he's a star. I think there are too many good supports right now to consider Hilly in that upper echelon because, again, very similar to Carzzy, he's just going to have some games where he completely runs it. But I think these two are a good complement to each other because when they're both on, it's actually very difficult to stop. Like, you're going to have games where they do play like a top 1, top 2 bot lane. In Europe, you're just not going to get that from a game-to-game basis, and so that's kind of reflected in my rankings. But overall, I am pretty positive on Vitality, and that's the reason they come in at number 4. I like VTO a lot. Photon is a superstar. I think Linsas is an upgrade to this team. Carzzy and Hilly are solid enough for you to be able to win with. This should be a team that ends up making top 4. I don't think that's, confirmed by any, metric. I think Mad and Heretics are on the same tier of team as a team like Vitality, but, they should be a team that tries to contend for top 3. I don't know how realistic it would be. I think it's all up to Linsas and whether or not he can come in and really be that elite game-changing jungler. But if that happens, this team absolutely does have enough talent to be able to make Worlds. But now we get to move on to my top 3. These are the 3 teams that I do believe will be representing the LEC at Worlds this year, at least going into the summer split. Who knows what's going to happen over the course of the 4 weeks of the regular season, let alone the entirety of summer and then the season finals and all of that jazz. But at least for now, these are the top 3 teams in the LEC, and that kicks off with my number 3 team being Team BDS. I think this is a pretty easy ranking for me. Everybody from here on out feels pretty stock standard in terms of where they end up landing. BDS is a very talented team, and they're super consistent across the board. You got some underperformances out of them in the spring split, especially as opposed to what they were in winter, but honestly, to me, they are underperformances. I have a pretty good suspicion that this team is going to bounce back and be just as good in summer as they were in winter, and I think they're going to be able to compete with the top 2 teams. To make this a lot more interesting, their kryptonite has been best of 5s. They've just not been able to win those, but is that going to be something that continues onwards? That's such a hard thing to predict. They have such a small sample size of best of 5s that it's really hard to know if the problem is them or if the problem was just the teams that they ended up drawing, but we'll go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Adam in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Ice at AD carry, and Labrav at support. Again, same 5 they've run all year long with the exception of the semifinals in winter, obviously. But for the most part, I mean, this is the best lineup they could get together. There are very few upgrades that you could get from where they're at right now. Top lane for me is still one of the strongest positions for them in the league. Adam is a true star. I know people like to clown on the fact that there are a couple of games every once in a while where he looks poor, but he is still very good. Now, I had him at number 1 going into the previous split. That maybe was a little bit too high. I would argue that spring was his worst split ever as a pro. I mean, maybe that first stint on BDS before he ended up getting sent down and, had to work his way back up by dominating the ERLs. But Fnatic, I mean, his second stint on BDS, they've all been essentially phenomenal runs for him individually as a player. You can talk about his fit on Fnatic as a bit of a problem, but this second run on BDS has been exceptional. And unfortunately, that kind of came crashing down a bit in spring. It wasn't horrible. He still was winning most of his matchups, but as opposed to the just consistent dominance that he was offering over the past year or so, it was more so a little bit more sporadic. I still think that's in him, and I still think that he is going to be a bit more volatile just because of the way he plays the game, but his champion pool's wide enough, and I think that it was a bit more of a mental thing with his communication with the rest of the team. Hopefully that ends up working itself out, because he was amazing in winter, was clearly the best top laner in my opinion in winter, and to me, I think you can make a really strong argument he was the best top laner across the LEC in 2023. I think Broken Blade's really the only other player with a resume like that. And so Adam, to me, clearly deserves an A- grade. If you wanted to give him B+, I can live with that, but I don't think you can go any lower than that. Adam is simply too talented to be given any less respect than that. I know that there's a lot of reasons that people don't want to rank Adam highly, but in terms of gameplay, I just can't justify him being anywhere lower than top 3. And then you start to get into some of the more questionable pieces. Sheo in the jungle has not been very good this year. I mean, he's not been bad. He's just kind of been an average player for BDS, which coming off of a very good rookie year in 2023 is a bit disappointing. I do think he's been worse in 2024 in terms of his ability to consistently take over games. I don't think he's been awful. Again, average is probably a better way to describe it, which is why he comes in bang on average in terms of my jungle rankings, number 5. I think this is relatively fair. The top 4 all feel pretty locked in, but Sheo's upside in terms of what he could potentially accomplish is probably better than almost anybody else in the league. Maybe we see some jump ups from players that, are new. Linsas, I think, has the potential to kind of skyrocket in those rankings. I think someone like Juhan has the potential to jump up if things end up going right. But for now, Sheo occupies that number 5 spot, the top of the B tier, if you will, the top of the, we'll see kind of players. And I think that pretty accurately represents where I view Sheo. He is a good piece, not a great piece for this team. And I think the same could be said about Nuke. He is going to come in one spot higher as the number 4 mid laner because, again, mid is just so volatile. But my main concern with Nuke is not his ability to play most matchups. It's the fact that more so than any other mid laner in the region, he gets destroyed by caps. And that is just a bit of a problem when you kind of have to go through G2 to be one of the better teams in the league. We've seen this in the best of 5s that BDS has played against G2 so far this year. They've just not been able to keep up. Like, Nuke is not a good player into caps. He is good into almost anybody else in the league. In fact, his matchups into the other top mid laners like Humanoid and like, VTO, they're actually really positive, and we've seen him do well in those matchups, but it is just such a crippling problem that it honestly does hold BDS back because it just doesn't feel like Nuke is the kind of player that can keep up with that level of mechanical dominance, and it has been a bit of a problem for this team in the past. Outside of that, though, I don't really have any huge problems with Nuke. In fact, I've really kind of grown on Nuke in a lot of other areas of the game. Very well-rounded, kind of jack-of-all-trades type of mid laner, and I think that is valuable for BDS, but again, very similar to Sheo, not somebody that I think is going to carry you across the finish line. Where you're hoping to get that improvement from Spring is the bot lane. Ice has still been very good. I'm not going to try to criticize him. He's still going to come in as a B+. My number 3 AD carry, ADC is a very weak role, quite frankly, at the LEC level and in the West in general. Ice has been one of the few ADCs that I would consider genuinely consistent. That's not to say that his highs are as high as maybe even some of the players below him like Karzi, but his lows are higher than just about anybody else in the league. In fact, I think you can make an argument that he has the highest floor of any AD carry in the LEC by a pretty considerable margin. You just don't see those horrible performances from Ice. And to be fair, that's one of the most valuable traits he could possibly have, is just being consistent enough to know what you're getting on a game-to-game basis, to be predictable in a good sense for BDS. There are very, very few AD carries in the West that have that trait. Ice probably the only one here in the LEC, so he is a positive. And then there's Labrov. I mean, one split ago, I would have said Labrov is probably the number 1 support in the league. He was the number 1 support in Winter, and Mickey is certainly not having an exceptional year, which we will get into in a bit, but it's just really hard to predict that because Spring was definitely a worse split from him. He was average and at times below average in Spring after a phenomenal 2023 getting back on a good team and then a breakout 2024 Winter split. It's just really sad to see a guy who was very much like a finalist for MVP for me in Winter kind of return to just being mediocre. I don't think that will continue. I'm trying to meet in the middle with a B+ here. He can be an A-graded support. That is a realistic outcome for someone like Labrov. It's never been a skill issue for him. Talent-wise, he has always been someone that we're looking at and kind of waiting for him to break out and become that superstar support that we know he can be. It's just not exactly happened for him. I think it could here in summer. I think that that's a reasonable outcome. If him and Ice are very consistent and end up becoming the number 1 bot lane in the LEC, then I think BDS could do even better than this number 3 ranking. But again, this is a team that is yet to be able to win a best of 5 this year, and they've been in a couple of situations to try to get themselves to do so. There are real question marks when it comes to whether or not BDS can live up to the hype. I love Adam. I'm going to continue to defend him on this channel. I think Ice is super consistent. Labrov has MVP potential. Nuke is somebody who has been able to beat other mid laners, and Sheo is certainly not somebody that's going to lose you a ton of games. There are just a few too many holes in this roster in comparison to the top 2 for me to say that they are better than either of them, but they are certainly very, very close. But that moves us into the top 2, and you know who the top 2 are. It's the 2 teams that represented the LEC at MSI, and honestly, you probably know what order they're in. I'm not going to try to keep the suspense for long. Coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be Fnatic. I think it's fair to put this team at number 2 right now. I certainly don't think they're locked in at number 2, and I mean that in a negative way, where I think this team could potentially do worse in summer than they did at any point in spring or winter. I think that is realistic for them, but at least for now, there is way too much on this team that has been going right over the past few months for me to say that it's just suddenly going to fall apart. I think for the most part, this is actually a very dangerous and scary team in their current state. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Oscar Rinnan in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Jun at support. Let's talk about the players that have really kind of emerged this year, and there's really no one else to start with when you're talking about emerging threats than Jun in the support position. He's going to jump all the way up to number 4. This is probably the biggest jump that a player makes. I shouldn't even say probably. This is almost certainly the biggest jump a player has made going from spring to summer in terms of my personal rankings. I was all out on Jun going into the year. Anybody who watched him on KDF had to know that this guy had an uphill battle here in the LEC, because he was horrible on KDF. There really is no other way to put it. When he was in the LCK, he was actively one of the 2 worst players in the region. Like, it wasn't even remotely close. Him and Taiyun were just horrible as a bot lane duo. They were not playable. And so for Jun to be the big off-season acquisition for Fnatic, I questioned it. I certainly was concerned. He came in very low in terms of my support rankings. And honestly, in winter, he kind of reiterated a lot of the points that I brought in. He was generally below average. Him and Noah were not good. Noah looked way worse at the beginning of the year than he did at any point with Trimby in 2023. And that really started to raise some question marks. And so Jun, going into spring, was still a player I was like, he's going to hold this Fnatic team back. They are not going to be an elite team until they find a better support. But lo and behold, playoffs come around in the spring split, and Jun just like flips this switch in his brain where he becomes the best support in the region. I don't know what happened, but for that playoff run in the spring split, he was the best support in the LEC. He was arguably the best player in the LEC during that playoff run. I don't know if that's sustainable. He was really good at MSI as well, which is a very encouraging sign, but man, it was just so out of character. It was so surprising to see him do so well after having such a rough start to his pro career. And so for now, he is going to jump up to a B+. He is going to jump up to number 4 in my support rankings. But when it comes to ranking him against, Labrov and Trimby, who have been doing this for a lot longer than Jun, it's just hard for me to rank him above them, even though he was better than they were at the end of spring. If he does it again, if he comes out here in summer and is the best support in Europe and is the best support in the LEC and is first team All-Pro and, really dominates, then yeah, I'm all in on Jun. I just need to see it again for more than just a playoff run, because even in the regular season in spring, there were some more concerning moments. And so it's a small sample size, but that small sample size has been extraordinarily good. And then Razork and Humanoid, they're the other big positives here. I think you can make a strong case that right now Razork and Huma are both on pace for their best split or best year on Fnatic overall. Like, Huma and Razork have been good, but they've certainly not been consistent as Fnatic players, and especially as a duo. But right now in 2024, I think we are seeing the best version of this mid jungle that we've ever seen. Humanoid coming in at number 2, Razork coming in at number 3. Some people are going to be pissed that Razork's not an A graded player. I will continue to get these comments, for the rest of time, because apparently I'm labeled as a Razork hater, but I just view Razork as somebody a bit more inconsistent. He still has those games where when he loses early, he's just a bit lost on what to do in the mid game, and that's fine. That's his weakness as a player, but that's a little bit too big of a weakness for me to consider him an A-, although it is super close. And honestly, if you wanted him at an A-, go ahead. But for me, he comes in just below GIANTX in terms of my rankings. I think that's a relatively fair place for him to be. He comes in above El Yoya, which is a really strong place for him to be. I can't stress enough how big that is for someone like Razork, because he does have such a clear playstyle, as opposed to a lot of these other jack-of-all-trades kinds of junglers. Razork is a little bit more of his style, and yet he's still just as effective as a lot of them, which is very, very important. And again, his consistency has gone up, which is why he gets that B+ grade, is that you're not really having as many of those bad games because his ability to win early has just gotten more consistent and better over the course of his time here on Fnatic. I think a lot of that has to do with him understanding his role better, but a lot of that also has to do with Humanoid just winning a lot in the mid lane. This is not something that they have been used to, is regular season Humanoid. Humanoid has been amazing in series that matter. When he got to Worlds in 2022, when he was in the playoffs in 2022 and 2023, that's when Humanoid stepped up. But go back and watch those regular season games from both 2022 and 2023. This guy just completely mentally checked out. And if that's the Humanoid that you were going to get this year, then Fnatic struggles a lot more in the regular season. But that's really not the Humanoid that we've gotten so far. He has been locked in basically the entirety of the year, and that makes him a huge threat. I honestly very narrowly gave him an A- grade. I think he's deserving of an A-, but you are still going to get a few games where he just kind of fades into the background a bit more than I would like from an A- kind of player. I don't know if he has that same killer instinct that he has always had, but even still, like, that is such a small nitpick. If you want him as an A, let alone an A-, like, I'm kind of there with you. He's going to give you performances that are pretty close to that throughout a lot of the year, and I do think that he is deserving of being considered the second best mid laner without really any competition, right? Like, he's not in contention for number 1. Number 1 is obvious, and he's not in contention for number 3 because he is a tier jump ahead of everybody else in the league. He is just very, quietly slotted into this number 2 spot, and I think that that's a pretty good place for him. He is an amazing asset for this team to have, and him and Razork, like I said, are maybe having their most consistent split ever in Fnatic uniforms, but I do have concerns with this team, which is why I do not think that they are a team that I would expect to compete for number 1. and it's top and it's bot. I just have concerns with these players. I'll start with Noah, because I was higher on him going into the year. He has regressed from what he was for Fnatic in summer of last year. Part of that, I think, was June really struggling out of the gate. June was losing laning phases for Fnatic's bot lane in winter, and I think Noah never really recovered from that, but Noah also is really just like a player that does not have that, like, it factor, and I don't know how else to say it. I know that sounds really mean and rude to say, but Noah lacks that killer instinct that I was talking about with Razork and Humanoid. He just doesn't have that. When the lights are brightest, he is a little bit quieter. He does not want to be the primary carry on this team. He has made that abundantly clear, and if that's the case, he's never going to be an elite AD carry at this level. I still think he can be valuable. He still comes in as a B grade, the number 6 AD carry. I just don't think he's going to be on the same level as some of the other best ADCs. Maybe if Jun continues to be as consistent as he is, Noah can kind of continue to be that mid to late game, just consistent carry for this team, which is what he was at MSI. I think that was a bit of a positive for them, but I just don't have a lot of faith that Noah's ever going to turn into this star, because it just doesn't feel like he has the mentality to do so. And then Oscar Rinnan in the top lane, kind of the opposite problem. Oscar is, he sees himself as the main character in a lot of these games, and sometimes it just doesn't end up working out that way. He's going to come in at number 6 as well, same with Noah, but this is up from spring, because, man, he started off this year horrible. I was ready to give up on Oscar Rinnan, quite frankly, after winter. He was what held this team back from getting anything higher than 4th in the winter playoffs, and, you know, I was really ready to be like, I'm just out on Oscar. I think that he's carried by, you know, Razork and Huma and being on this good team, and, you know, really isn't winning all that much in the top lane, but his mechanics are still really solid, and he's able to win maybe a bit more than I give him credit for, and so he is going to jump up to the top of B tier. That number 6 ranking, again, top 5. Number 5 is irrelevant. He's not better than irrelevant. Number 4 is Kana. He's not better than Kana, at least until proven otherwise, and so I think 6 is a relatively fair ranking for him, but I don't think Oscar's a star either. He is the definition, again, of a B player. Inconsistently very good. He's going to have some performances where he looks dominant and he completely carries games. He's going to have some performances where he runs it and looks horrible, especially in bad matchups. It's just kind of what you have to live with Oscar Rinnan. It just kind of is the player that he is. I don't think he's a star, but I do think he's good enough for you to be able to win with, and we saw that last split. Fnatic got to the finals for a reason, and it's because Razork and Huma were going crazy and Jun figured something out. If those three can continue to pop off and be positives for this team, then Fnatic is still going to be just as dangerous as they were at the end of spring. But if you can get those next level jumps from Noah and Oscar, the upside of this team is still there. I think they could make a real impact. I just need to see it a bit more out of what I would consider to be the weak links of the team. But that's going to bring us to number 1 in terms of my power rankings. This is no surprise. It's the back-to-back-to-back at the current time of recording champions, G2 Esports, coming in at number 1. And surprise, surprise, they're number 1 across the board. Not only are they number 1 in terms of power rankings, I have every single one of their players ranked as number 1 in terms of their positions. That might come as a bit of a shock if you followed my channel over the course of this year, because I've been nothing if not critical of Mickey X in particular, but everybody else, I feel pretty good about, and we'll talk about why Mickey does end up coming in at number 1, but of course, their lineup is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. What is there to say about G2 that I haven't already talked about so much over the course of this year? Not only are they the team that we've talked the most about, not only on this channel, but I'm sure in every single league circle you've heard about. There is no LEC team that has been discussed more than G2, but there really isn't a lot to talk about in terms of, oh, this player might move up or down or in some way or another. This feels pretty locked in terms of where we can expect them to be. The only question is whether or not they're going to keep their foot on the gas without really anything to play for here, because they have not only already qualified for the season finals, but they are as sure as you can possibly be that they are going to go to Worlds unless something catastrophic happens in those season finals. And so there really isn't a ton for them to do here in summer. The only reason that they would go out and try is for pride, which, you know, obviously this team went out and did in spring. They didn't need to win spring, but they won spring anyways. And so, you know, good on them. They are G2. Like, they are the threats for a reason. But let's talk about each of these players individually, what they do well. Broken Blade's going to come in as my number 1 top laner. He's going to have the same grade as both Photon and Adam. I think he's relatively in the same vein, but he's the most consistent of those 3, which is why he comes in at the top of that ranking. I don't think it's entirely crazy to say that Broken Blade might be number 2 in terms of mechanics, maybe even number number 3 in terms of mechanics out of those 3. His mechanics are excellent. They still are really top tier, and sometimes I do think they get a bit underrated, but he's going up against some juggernauts mechanically in the top lane like Photon and Adam, who are just able to win some crazy matchups. But in terms of game-to-game consistency, there's just nobody that I trust more than Broken Blade. And one of the big traits for BB that has really separated him is just his clutchness. He is so good when the lights are bright. When you get to those playoff series, when you get to the finals, that's where Broken Blade plays some of his best League of Legends. And I think that's a really impressive trait. It's really funny. I think longtime viewers of the channel know my fun arc with Broken Blade, but newer viewers might not have the same kind of context for that. I used to hate Broken Blade back on TSM, even on Schalke. I used to think he was crazy overrated, that he was a player that really kind of needed resources. Like, he was horrible weak side. He was horrible when he was not the focal point of the team and really needed to be kind of the primary option in order to function. But he came over to G2 and really kind of reworked his game, really fit the system a lot better. I gave him so much credit for completely kind of reinvigorating his own career and kind of revitalizing his own play style. But I think there are times where it feels like I'm a bit of a hater because I hold him to such a high standard. And that's really it, right? I just think he's so good that I expect so much out of him. And he's the number 1 top laner right now. He has been for quite a while. He's just a ridiculously good player. And then you've got Yike in the jungle. This is not a player that people can say that I have said I'm too low on. I have been a Yike defender every single moment of every single day. I have continued to say that I think Yike is honestly underrated by a majority of the community at this point. His individual accomplishments are ridiculous. Even not like going off of the fact that, yes, he gets an easy situation. Getting to play with Caps is a lot easier of a circumstance. Broken Blade, you know, even Hans and Mickey at times, right? This is a very stacked team and it makes his job a lot easier, but he's creating so many of these advantages that G2 is getting. He is way better this year than he was last year. Last year, there were moments where it's like, yeah, Caps has to play Sejuani mid so that he can play his carry in the jungle. Now he's arguably the best tank jungler in the league. Like, it truly is crazy the development that he has gone on. G2 has one of the most consistent coaching and development staffs in the world at any level, in any region. And I think Yike and Broken Blade, they're very good examples of that. When you join this system, you simply get better in a lot of different areas. And we'll save Caps. We'll talk about Hans and Mickey. They're just right? Like, if you're looking for a reason to be a bit more concerned about this team, I'm not sold on the bot lane. Yes, they come in as number 1 in their positions because Hans doesn't really have a ton of competition in terms of being able to dominate lane domestically. There just aren't other players who are as talented as he is, and so he can get away with so much. He gets exposed a bit internationally because he is a bit more of a flawed player. It's why he's a B+ for me and not like an A-graded player even coming in as the number 180 carry. It's because I think if you had more talent at this position, perhaps Hans would get kind of knocked down the pecking order. I don't think Hans is the kind of player that's just going to run the AD carry position, and if somebody emerges like Supa or Ice or, you know, really anybody, Carzzy in that, you know, position, I think Hans could be dethroned as that number 1 ADC. I don't feel great about having him in that role, but there just aren't a lot of great ADCs at the LEC level, so Hans kind of defaults as the best because he is so good in the 2v2. Now, when you can slow him down in the early game, if you ask him to play something that needs to scale a bit more into the late game, be a bit more passive, it's really not his playstyle, and he has really struggled on that in the past, especially internationally, but, you know, at least at the domestic level, I don't think he's going to be necessarily a problem for you. The concern is Mickey X, right? And that's a weird thing to say. He was the MVP last year. He was the best player in the LEC in 2023. But if you watch any of the games in 2024, this guy's been bad. Like, not just okay, like, not just, he's been a little below average. He's been bad. Like, truly one of the least valuable players in the LEC towards his team's actual success. The problem is that it's Mickey X. You have to imagine he's going to get back on track, and he might have done that at MSI. He found his weird comfort pick of the year. Last year it was Braum that helped him really stabilize. This year it seems to be Poppy's support that really seemed to stabilize him at MSI. Perhaps this team is just going to spam that for a bit, get his confidence back up, and then he can play well again. It's always kind of been a bit of a thing with Mickey as he goes in these spurts of being good and bad. He was horrible throughout all of 2022, and you're just hoping that you can get a better version of what you've gotten out of him so far this year. But again, it's Mickey X. He's going to stay at number 1 until proven otherwise. If Labrov had another really good split and really come out and been like a clear number 1 support again, he would have taken this number 1 spot. If Trimby had come out and really dominated for Heretics and lifted them up, he would have gotten this number 1 spot. Jun is hot on the trails to try to get this number 1 spot. Even someone like Alvaro, I think, is in the conversation to potentially try and get this number 1 spot. Mickey does not have a hold on this for long if he continues to play the way that he does, but for now, they're the best bot lane, and he steps up when it matters the most. It's a very cop-out-ish answer. I understand that, but I just have to default to the fact that Mickey is going to figure it out. If he does it, we go from there. But at least for now, I'm going to expect him to do so. And then we haven't talked about Caps, but it's Caps. I mean, truly, this is the player that needs the least amount of conversation because he's the best player that Europe has ever had. That's not even disputable. Is there anybody that would even argue that at this point? Caps is the best European player of all time, and it's not particularly close, in my opinion. He's an A+. He is so clearly the best player in the region. He hides every single flaw that we've talked about with the rest of this team. Broken Blade, sometimes over-aggressive, can lose matchups in the regular season, doesn't matter. Yikes sometimes struggles a little bit at tempo in the early game, doesn't matter. Hans and Mickey can sometimes just run it down. Mickey in particular can have 8 death games at 20 minutes, doesn't matter. Caps is so good that he will single-handedly win you games without any help from anyone else. That's what Caps is at this point. He has re-emerged as a potential top 5 player in the world, and we saw that again at MSI, where he showed up and showed out. He bodied players like Cream when given the opportunity. He is an elite level player, and he is the best that Europe has to offer. He is the best that the West has to offer by a large margin, and he's the reason for optimism on G2. So long as he is the mid laner for G2 Esports, they are the favorite of every split for the rest of time. That is the difference that Caps makes. I am all in on G2. Not that that's some sort of hot take, but I imagine they will continue their dominance towards the end here of 2024. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Summer Split 2024 Primer and Power Rankings video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Again, controversial takes in this video. These opinion-based videos are always going to be a bit more let's just say controversial in terms of the response that I'll get in the comments and in the likes and dislikes. And so if you did enjoy the video, it would really mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. Of course, we're going to be covering the LEC every single week on this channel. And so if you're interested, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering the LEC. We already talked about the LPL. The weekly reviews for that are also going to be coming, throughout the rest of this month. And of course, the LCS and the LCK are starting up soon as well. We cover all 4 of the major regions every single week on this channel, including the NACL as that 5th region. And so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.